It all began in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people moved to escape the chaos of city life. The houses stood neatly aligned, lawns were trimmed to perfection, and the local homeowners association prided itself on maintaining what they called a peaceful community standard. For years, the neighborhood had been a picture of calm, until a new kind of conflict began to stir, one that revolved around a golden retriever named Max, and a neighbor who would soon become the center of a scandal nobody saw coming. Max wasn't just any dog. He was a companion, a loyal friend, and a playful spirit who had lived in the neighborhood since he was a puppy. His owner, Daniel, had raised him with patience and care. Max was friendly to children, gentle with the elderly, and rarely barked without reason. To Daniel, Max was part of the family. To everyone else in the neighborhood, Max was a joy except for one person. Karen. Karen lived 2 houses down. From the moment she moved in, she seemed to have something negative to say about nearly everything. The hedges were too tall, the mailboxes were too plain, the paint on someone's shutters didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic. And when it came to Max, she found her biggest complaint yet. At first it started small. Karen would make passive-aggressive comments about how loud dogs can ruin peace. Daniel brushed it off, knowing Max only barked when delivery trucks passed or when he spotted the occasional squirrel. But Karen's mutterings soon turned into open hostility. She began filing complaints with the HOA, claiming Max barked incessantly, at all hours of the day. The HOA, bound by its rules, reluctantly investigated. They sent a notice to Daniel warning him of noise disturbances. Daniel, though frustrated, tried to be patient. He kept Max inside more often, took him on walks further from the neighborhood, and even installed a privacy fence so Max wouldn't see squirrels in the yard. Still, Karen persisted, but soon became clear that Karen's issue wasn't really with Max, it was with control. She wanted to dictate the way her neighbors lived, and Daniel was quickly becoming her main target. The situation escalated when Karen began recording short clips of Max barking. She sent them to the HOA board with long, angry messages about constant noise. The problem: every recording was only a few seconds long, often taken when Max barked once or twice at a passing jogger. The board was beginning to tire of her complaints. But Karen wasn't about to give up. That's when she made her boldest move yet. One afternoon, while Max was lounging quietly in Daniel's yard, Karen called the police. She claimed the dog was uncontrollably aggressive and barking nonstop. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up to the street. Daniel was shocked when 2 officers knocked on his door, explaining they had received a complaint about his dog disturbing the peace. The neighborhood watched curiously from behind their blinds and across their lawns. Everyone knew Max wasn't a problem, and whispers spread quickly that Karen had finally gone too far. The officers, however, were obligated to investigate. They asked Daniel to bring Max outside, and the golden retriever wagged his tail happily, leaning against their legs as if greeting old friends. The officers noted how calm he was, how there was no excessive barking at all. Karen, standing smugly at the end of her driveway, crossed her arms and insisted they take the matter seriously. But as the officers continued their conversation with Daniel, something caught their attention. It wasn't Max at all, it was something happening at Karen's property. From her backyard came a faint but distinct noise. The sound was muffled at first, but the longer they listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't Max making the noise. It was something else entirely. The officers exchanged a look. They politely wrapped up with Daniel, assuring him that Max didn't appear to be a problem. Then, almost instinctively, their focus shifted toward Karen's house. She noticed the change immediately and stiffened, suddenly looking uneasy. Sound from her backyard grew louder, breaking the quiet of the street. It wasn't barking, it was something stranger. And whatever it was, Karen clearly didn't want anyone hearing it. The neighbors, sensing something unusual, began to step outside to listen. A low murmur spread through the street as curiosity grew. Karen, once smug and confident, was now visibly nervous. She snapped at the officers, insisting they had no reason to look further. But the noise from her property only intensified, and the officers knew they couldn't ignore it. Karen had called the cops on a dog butt in doing so. She had accidentally exposed her own secret. The officers began walking toward her yard, their eyes narrowing as the sound became unmistakable. The crowd of neighbors grew larger, their whispers turning into gasps. Whatever was happening on Karen's property wasn't normal. And as the officers pushed forward, Karen's carefully crafted facade of control began to crumble. She had spent months trying to dictate how her neighbors lived, but now the spotlight was turning on her. The truth about what she had been hiding was about to come out. and it would shock the entire neighborhood. The morning after Karen's heated confrontation with Mark over his dog, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Word traveled quickly in communities like these, especially when a figure as notorious as Karen was involved. Everyone had seen her storm across Mark's yard, wagging her finger and spewing complaints about a supposedly noisy dog that most neighbors hardly noticed. To some, it was just Karen being Karen, a woman whose life seemed fueled by stirring trouble wherever she could find it. But to Mark, it felt like the start of something bigger. His dog, Buddy, was a gentle Labrador who had never harmed anyone. Sure, he barked occasionally, mostly at passing squirrels or the mail truck, but nothing unusual for a family pet. Still, Karen seemed determined to frame him as a menace. Mark could only shake his head, unaware that her vendetta was just warming up. By noon, the situation escalated. A black and white patrol car rolled slowly down the quiet suburban street. Its presence was like a sudden shadow, drawing curious glances from behind curtains and blinds. It was unusual for the police to show up in such a calm neighborhood, and the sight immediately raised suspicion. The vehicle stopped right in front of Mark's driveway, its flashing lights muted but unmistakable. Two officers stepped out, their professional expressions masking curiosity. For them, it was another routine caller-neighbor dispute, the kind that usually turned out to be exaggerated complaints. Still, policy required them to respond. They approached the front door just as Mark stepped outside, already sensing who had orchestrated this unwelcome visit. The officers explained they had received a complaint. A neighbor had accused his dog of being aggressive, loud, and a potential threat to the community. As they spoke, Karen lingered at the edge of her yard, arms crossed tightly over her chest, lips pressed into a self-satisfied smirk. She had called them, of course, and now stood watching as if expecting a victory. Mark kept his composure, though irritation simmered beneath the surface. He invited the officers to see Buddy for themselves. The Labrador wagged his tail eagerly, bounding forward, with the kind of excitement that only a friendly dog could muster. Far from the snarling beast Karen had described, Buddy licked at the officer's hands, his tail thumping like a drum against the floor. The officers exchanged a look. This wasn't the dangerous animal they'd been told about. Still, procedure demanded they ask questions. They inquired about barking, disturbances, and whether Buddy had ever escaped or harmed anyone. Mark answered honestly, yes, Buddy barked occasionally. No, he had never harmed anyone, and no complaints had ever been filed before. As this exchange unfolded, Karen drifted closer, pretending to check her mailbox, though her eyes never left the scene. She was itching to interject, to spin her narrative into something more convincing. She insisted the dog barked for hours at night, disturbing her peace, and that she feared he might break loose and attack her. Her tone was theatrical, her gestures exaggerated, but the officers remained unconvinced. Then something unexpected happened. One of the officers noticed Karen's nervous glances, not toward the dog, but toward her own backyard. It was subtle at first, a flick of her eyes, a slight tension in her posture. As Mark calmly defended his dog, the officer's curiosity was piqued. Why was she so uneasy? Why did she seem more concerned with what might be seen behind her house than with the supposed threat standing in front of them? The officer casually shifted his stance, peering past Karen's property line. From the corner of his eye, he spotted something unusual: tarps strung across a section of her yard, hastily arranged as if hiding something. Behind the tarps there appeared to be structures not typical for a suburban backyard. They weren't sheds or gazebos. They looked more improvised, more secretive. Karen noticed his glance and immediately stiffened. She quickly redirected the conversation back to Buddy, raising her voice with renewed urgency. But it was too late. The officer's interest had been caught. Meanwhile, neighbors had begun to gather. The presence of a patrol car was enough to draw attention, and now whispers spread like wildfire. People peered from porches, pretending to sweep or water lawns, all while keeping their ears tuned to the unfolding drama. They saw Karen pointing, gesturing, her voice carrying louder than necessary, and they saw Buddy, tail wagging, the very picture of innocence. It didn't take long for suspicion to shift. The officers, maintaining their professionalism, concluded that Buddy posed no immediate threat. They explained to Mark that unless there were repeated, verifiable incidents, there was no cause for concern. They even noted that most dogs bark occasionally. It was part of their nature. Karen's face flushed with indignation. This wasn't the outcome she had envisioned. She wanted citations, warnings, maybe even threats of removal. Instead, she was left fuming, her complaint dismissed as unsubstantiated. But worse for her, one officer lingered, eyes narrowing slightly as he observed her backyard again. The visit wrapped up, but as the officers prepared to leave, one pulled Mark aside. Quietly, he mentioned noticing something odd behind Karen's property, though he didn't elaborate. He assured Mark that if further complaints arose, they'd handle them, but there might be something else worth keeping an eye on. Mark didn't press the issue though. Curiosity tugged at him. As the patrol car rolled away, Karen stormed back into her house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. The neighborhood settled back into its rhythm, but the air carried a new undercurrent of tension. Mark stood in his yard, Buddy at his side, replaying the encounter in his mind. Karen had overplayed her hand. She had tried to weaponize authority against a harmless dog, but instead, she had drawn attention to herself. And though the officers hadn't said much, Mark sensed something larger was brewing. For the first time, it wasn't Buddy who seemed to be on trial, it was Karen, and whatever she was hiding behind those tarps in her yard might be far more disruptive to the neighborhood than a barking dog ever could be. The seeds of suspicion had been planted. All it would take was one more incident, one more spark, and Karen's carefully guarded secret would begin to unravel before everyone's eyes, and that moment was coming much sooner than anyone expected. By the time the officers stepped off Karen's porch, the neighborhood was buzzing. Curtains shifted behind glass, phones lit up with text messages, and whispers traveled faster than the wind. Everyone had seen the flashing lights, and everyone had heard Karen's loud performance about the menace living next door. Yet, the officers seemed strangely calm as they crossed the street, jotting notes and making a series of quiet observations. What they had discovered inside Karen's home wasn't what anyone expected. For weeks, Karen had positioned herself as the righteous defender of peace and order, the one woman determined to stop the constant barking of a dog she swore was disrupting the entire community. But when the officers stepped through her front door, the truth immediately began to unravel. The inside of her home was far from the pristine image she presented to her neighbors. The air was thick, heavy with a sour smell that clung to the walls and floors. The source wasn't immediately obvious, but then came the scratching, subtle at first, then more frantic. The officers froze. It wasn't the sound of a single dog at all. One of them followed the noise to a closed door at the back of the house. When they pushed it open, the sight shocked even seasoned professionals. Inside the room were multiple cages, stacked 2 and 3 high, each holding a small animal. Dogs, cats, and even rabbits huddled in cramped, filthy spaces. Some barked weakly, others barely moved at all. Karen, flustered and defensive, tried to explain. She insisted they were rescues, strays she had taken in to protect from the streets. But her story didn't match the condition of the animals. Malnourished, neglected, and scared, they told a silent truth no excuse could cover up. The irony was staggering. While Karen had been calling the police week after week about one well-fed, happy dog next door, she had been hiding an illegal operation in her own house. Whether it was hoarding, neglect, or something darker, the officers weren't sure yet, but it was enough to spark a full investigation. Word spread quickly through the cul-de-sac. Neighbors who once rolled their eyes at Karen's endless complaints now felt something closer to anger. How many times had she pointed fingers while hiding her own secret? How many times had she wasted everyone's time, all while allowing innocent animals to suffer just a few feet away from where she stood, yelling about noise? The police didn't leave empty-handed that evening. They took notes, documented the condition of the animals, and made several phone calls. Within an hour, animal control arrived with vans. The quiet street turned into a scene of flashing lights and official vehicles, each one pulling up to address the mess Karen had tried so hard to conceal. Neighbors peeked through blinds, some daring to step onto their porches, arms crossed as they watched Karen protest. She waved her arms wildly, her face red with fury and desperation, but no one rushed to her defense. For years, she had been the loudest critic of everyone else's behavior, complaining about lawns, fences, parties, and now, a harmless dog. But tonight her authority crumbled. The dog owner watched in silence from his porch. His golden retriever sat quietly beside him, tail wagging lazily, almost as if sensing the irony of the moment. This was no longer just about barking. It was about hypocrisy, justice, and the unraveling of a neighbor who had taken her obsession too far. By the time the animal control officers carried the last cage out of Karen's home, the crowd of neighbors had grown bold. Some whispered, some shook their heads in disgust, but all shared the same thought. The truth had finally caught up with her, and yet, this was only the beginning. What the police uncovered that night was shocking enough, but as the investigation deepened, Karen's web of secrets would only grow darker. The dog may have been the spark, but what was about to come would shake the neighborhood to its core. The night ended with Karen standing on her porch, her voice hoarse from shouting, as officers closed the door behind them and warned her not to interfere. Her reputation, her power, and her carefully maintained facade had begun to collapse, piece by piece. But the next chapter of her downfall was waiting just around the corner, and it would reveal even more than anyone was prepared for. The neighborhood had grown restless in the days following the police visit. Whispers spread faster than anyone could contain them. What had been dismissed as just another Karen incident now carried a heavier weight, because the officers hadn't simply arrived, given a warning, and left. No, something about their reaction had unsettled everyone. They lingered longer than expected, asked more questions than seemed necessary, and when they finally walked away, their expressions were colder than when they arrived. It was as though they had stumbled upon something more than a barking dog complaint, but Karen pretended nothing was amiss. She doubled down on her usual antics, marching around with her clipboard, scribbling notes about noise violations, overgrown lawns, and improper trash bins. To the untrained eye, she was the same as always, nosy, loud, and eager to assert herself. Yet to those who paid closer attention, the cracks in her polished act were beginning to show. The dog's owner, meanwhile, found himself walking a fine line. His Labrador, Max, had become the target of Karen's daily obsession. Every bark, every wag of the tail seemed to trigger her wrath. The strange part was that Max wasn't particularly noisy. He barked occasionally, like any dog would, but never excessively. Neighbors who had lived nearby for years confirmed that he had always been well behaved. So why, then, was Karen so determined to have him silenced? The question nagged at the community, and soon small inconsistencies began to emerge. One neighbor mentioned how Karen had claimed she couldn't sleep at night because of the barking, yet lights were often seen glowing in her windows at odd hours, long after the dog had settled quietly for the night. Another recalled how she once said Max barked all morning, but he had been at the groomer that entire day. The puzzle pieces weren't adding up, and the unease that followed the police visit only heightened the suspicion. Then, one afternoon, something happened that changed everything. A delivery driver, struggling with a heavy package, accidentally left a box on Karen's porch. It wasn't unusual, packages often ended up at the wrong address, but this one was different. The box sat outside for hours, untouched. The driver eventually returned to retrieve it, but not before a sharp-eyed neighbor noticed a curious detail. When the driver lifted the box back up, Karen's door cracked open ever so slightly. A face peeked out, not Karen's, but someone else's. Word spread like wildfire. Who was that shadowy figure behind her door? Karen lived Eleanor, at least. That's what she told everyone. Her late husband had passed away years ago, and she often bragged about being independent, about managing her home without anyone's help. Yet now whispers of a secret occupant began to ripple through the block. It wasn't long before another clue emerged. A teenager cutting across the yard swore he heard faint sounds, metallic clinks, and muffled shuffling coming from Karen's basement window. At first, no one believed him. Kids often exaggerated. But then an older neighbor recalled how she once saw Karen hurrying inside with large bags of groceries, far too much for one person. She carried not just food, but bulk supplies, the kind someone would buy if they were stocking up for more than themselves. The police's strange behavior began to make sense. Perhaps their questions weren't just about a barking dog. Perhaps they had seen something, or someone, that wasn't supposed to be there. The dog's owner noticed it too. Karen's complaints seemed to grow louder only when certain noises, carried faintly from her own property, clang's voices, movements she couldn't completely muffle. It was as though she was using the dog as a distraction, deflecting attention away from her own secrets by making him the neighborhood villain. Then, late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the street grew quiet, the first undeniable proof emerged. The dog's owner, out for a walk with Max, passed by Karen's house. As he moved silently along the sidewalk, Max froze. His ears perked, and he growled softly at the basement window. The man paused, listening, and then he heard it too, but unmistakable voices, not one, but two, low and urgent, coming from beneath the house. He walked on quickly, not wanting to draw attention, but his heart raced. Karen was hiding something. From that point on, the atmosphere shifted. Neighbors became watchful, their suspicions sharpening into certainty. Every time Karen complained, every time she pointed fingers at the dog, it only deepened the belief that she was covering something up. The gossip transformed into quiet investigations. People took longer walks past her house, ears straining for sounds. Some even began recording faint noises from her property at night. Karen, sensing the growing scrutiny, became more frantic. Her voice rose, her accusations grew wilder, and she began threatening legal action against anyone who questioned her. But the louder she grew, the more obvious it became. Her outrage wasn't about the dog, it was about control, about diverting eyes away from the truth that lay just behind her basement walls. And though no one knew it yet, the secret she guarded so fiercely was about to spill into the open. Because one night, the police would return not for a noise complaint, but for something far more serious. And when they did, Karen's carefully built facade would finally collapse, leaving behind a truth darker than anyone had ever imagined. Neighborhood had seen Karens before, but none like this. This wasn't about barking, this was about something and someone Karen never wanted anyone to find. And soon, that secret would be dragged into the light. The neighborhood had been quiet for weeks after the police uncovered Karen's hidden operation in her garage. But quiet was a deceptive word. On the surface, the streets seemed calm, the lawns neatly trimmed, and the HOA newsletters continued to arrive like clockwork. Yet beneath the manicured image, the community was buzzing with whispers. People spoke in hushed tones when Karen's name came up. Some avoided her entirely, others, emboldened by her downfall, came forward with stories of their own complaints they had previously been too afraid to voice. For years, Karen had been the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood rules. She had no official authority, yet she wielded influence like a weapon. She patrolled the streets with a clipboard, reported imaginary violations, and hounded the HOA board until they took action. Many residents had suffered fines, letters, or threats of legal action because of her. Now, with her reputation shattered, the tables began to turn. That it started with a single neighbor who shared his story at the monthly HOA meeting. He revealed how Karen had once called the city over his backyard shed, claiming it was a fire hazard, when in truth, she just didn't like the sight of it. Another stood up, recounting how Karen reported her to animal control, insisting her cat was a feral menace. Slowly, one after another, residents stepped forward, painting a picture of a woman who thrived on intimidation. The HOA board, once reluctant to challenge her, now faced mounting pressure. The revelations about her secret operation in the garage had embarrassed them publicly. Local news stations had picked up the story, questioning how such activity could go unnoticed in a supposedly well-regulated community. To save face, the board needed to act decisively. A closed-door meeting was scheduled. The board, desperate to restore their credibility, discussed one thing: removing Karen from the community altogether. While HOA boards rarely pursued eviction, the bylaws included a rarely used clause for endangering the community's safety and reputation. It was a drastic measure, but after the police raid and the mountain of complaints from residents, it seemed justified. Gotten, of course, didn't go quietly. She stormed into the meeting, demanding her chance to speak. She insisted the allegations were lies, fabricated by neighbors who were jealous of her commitment to order. She blamed the dog incident for sparking a witch hunt against her, but her words fell flat. Too much had been revealed, and too many people had suffered under her constant harassment. The board voted unanimously. Karen was ordered to vacate her home within 60 days. The decision sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Some celebrated openly, calling it justice at last. Others watched nervously, wondering how Karen would respond. Because if there was one thing everyone knew about her, it was that she never accepted defeat quietly. As the weeks passed, her behavior grew more erratic. She confronted neighbors in the street, shouting about conspiracies against her. She left threatening notes on doorsteps, warning people they would regret crossing her. She even tried to rally a few allies, though most abandoned her when they realized the fight was lost. The once feared enforcer of the neighborhood had become a pariah, spiraling into desperation. Then, just when it seemed Karen had been backed into a corner, another secret emerged, one that deepened the scandal even further. While the police had shut down her garage operation, they had overlooked something else. A sharp-eyed neighbor noticed unusual activity in her backyard late at night, and curiosity got the better of him. What he discovered would not only expose Karen further but also ignite a firestorm that the HOA could no longer contain. The neighborhood thought they had seen the worst of her, but Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. The neighborhood had not been the same since the truth about Karen's secret came to light. For months, her voice had echoed across the cul-de-sac, constant complaints about the dog, endless arguments, and sharp remarks about how the community should be run. But now, silence filled the space where her authority once reigned. When the police revealed what she had been hiding, everything flipped overnight. The people who once sided with her, or at least stayed silent to avoid her wrath, now whispered behind closed doors. No one had expected the woman who spent so much energy pointing fingers to be concealing something far worse than the sound of a barking dog. The discovery of the hidden animals in her basement, the neglected and malnourished dogs she had been hoarding, spread like wildfire. The officers who entered her home that night didn't just find a single frightened pup. They found cages stacked one on top of another, each holding a dog that had been denied that freedom of sunlight and fresh air. The irony was too much for the neighbors to ignore. The same woman who tried to have another man's dog taken away had been the source of true cruelty all along. Karen's downfall wasn't sudden, it was catastrophic. The local news ran the story for days. The HOA board, which once catered to her endless complaints, distanced themselves immediately. Overnight she went from being the loudest voice in the room to a name spoken only in hushed tones. But what about the man she had tormented? For him, vindication felt like a long-awaited breath of fresh air. For months he had endured the stress of police visits, warning letters, and the humiliation of being treated like a careless dog owner. And now, the community finally saw the truth. His dog wasn't the problem, Karen was. Neighbors who had once avoided confrontation began stopping by his house, not just to apologize, but to check in. They brought treats for the dog, gave sympathetic smiles, and quietly admitted that they too had been afraid to stand up to Karen before. For the first time in years, there was a sense of unity among them. But Karen's saga didn't end with humiliation alone. There were legal consequences. Animal control seized every dog from her basement, placing them in shelters and rescues, where they could be cared for properly. The authorities pressed charges for neglect, and the HOA quickly convened an emergency meeting to discuss her standing in the community. The same Karen who had once boasted about being untouchable was now suspended from all HOA activities. Her reign as self-appointed watchdog was over, yet, even as her influence collapsed, Karen still fought to keep her place. She tried filing appeals, sending angry emails to the board, and even leaving handwritten notes on neighbors' doors accusing them of betrayal, but no one rallied to her side anymore. Her power came from fear and manipulation, and once that was stripped away, she had nothing left. Meanwhile, the man's dog, the very animal Karen had targeted, became something of a local hero. Children would stop to pet him during their walks, neighbors snapped photos of him lounging in the yard, and even the mailman who once looked nervous now greeted him with a cheerful pat on the head. The dog had never changed. He was the same loyal companion as before. The only thing that had changed was perspective. The community no longer saw him as the source of noise or trouble, but as the innocent victim of Karen's spiteful campaign. Time passed, and Karen's house became the quietest on the block. Curtains drawn, lights rarely on, and her once meticulously tended yard slowly falling into disrepair. She no longer hosted HOA meetings in her living room. She no longer yelled across the street at passing joggers. Her presence faded, and with it, the tension that had once gripped the neighborhood. But there was one final twist. Months after her downfall, a for sale sign appeared on Karen's lawn. Whispers spread quickly she was leaving. Some speculated she couldn't bear the humiliation of staying. Others suggested financial troubles had forced her hand after the legal fees and fines. Whatever the reason, the day the moving truck arrived, the neighbors quietly gathered. No one jeered, no one celebrated openly, but there was an unspoken sense of relief. The storm that had loomed over them for years was finally passing. When the truck pulled away and Karen's car disappeared down the street for the last time, it was as if the entire neighborhood exhaled together. Peace had returned. In the weeks that followed, the HOA shifted its tone. Instead of micromanaging every detail of homeowners' lives, the board adopted a softer approach. Rules still existed, but enforcement was fair, not vindictive. The neighbors found themselves talking more, gathering more often, and even laughing about the chaos they had once endured. And through it all, the dog remained at the center not of conflict, but of joy. His presence was no longer a point of contention, but a symbol of endurance. Despite the false accusations, the stress, and the countless times Karen tried to have him taken away, he had stayed loyal, strong, and unbothered in the end. Obsession with silencing one dog had led to her own downfall. The neighborhood moved forward, united in a way it hadn't been before, while Karen faded into a cautionary tale and example of how bitterness and control could consume someone until there was nothing left. As for the man and his dog, their lives settled into a new kind of normal. Evening walks were peaceful, Weekends in the yard were filled with friendly waves, and the once dense cul-de-sac finally felt like home again. The drama had ended, but the lesson lingered. Sometimes the loudest complainers are hiding the darkest secrets, and sometimes all it takes is the bark of one dog to bring the truth crashing down.